Bitcoin and AI. Those are two of the biggest, most profound innovation platforms in history. Each one of those is moving into its own S-curve, moving into prime time in terms of adoption. Bitcoin fits right into this new world as the payments ecosystem. So, but in terms of the convergence, so each one into its own S-curve, and these are massive growth opportunities, just massive opportunities. And so what do we have here? We have S-curves feeding S-curves because of this convergence. That's what you're feeling. And so it's going to create for these converged platforms super exponential growth.
Cathie Wood, the CEO of ARK Invest, predicts that Bitcoin is about to experience explosive growth and rapid adoption. And here's why. In a recent discussion, Cathie Wood touches on the convergence of AI and Bitcoin, explaining the transformative potential of these two technologies. Cathie Wood envisions a future where the rapid innovation of AI converges with the decentralized nature of Bitcoin's financial network. She believes this fusion will ignite a surge in productivity and revolutionize the global economy. This kind of disruptive innovation is a huge opportunity to unlock significant growth and redefine traditional economic models. We will now bring you clips of the discussion. Please take a little time to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel to show your support. Thanks and enjoy.
The reason the world is going to feel chaotic, even to us in some sense, we've been disappointed by some earnings results because, in the AI world, things are happening that we wouldn't have expected. So it's moving very quickly. And I think there is, if you look at consumer sentiment metrics out there, you'll see the consumer is kind of down. The consumer is not feeling very. Now, I think a lot of it is where the price level is in the economy. But a lot of it also is, if you look at surveys of people making $100,000 or more, their fear of losing their jobs is moving up dramatically here because of AI. And if unemployment follows with this line, it will end up somewhere in the 6 to 7% range in the next year or so. So that's something that's happening that's unsettling. This is much like the late 1800s, early 1900s, telephone, electricity, and internal combustion engine going to change the world completely. And society was very uncertain, unstable. There was a lot of angst back then. And I think there is, so innovation, all of the innovation I'm talking about has huge ramifications for wealth creation and standards of living. Right? Productivity gains. We think productivity is going to absolutely boom here. And we think real GDP growth could appreciate from where it's been in the last 125 years, real GDP growth from 3% at a compound annual rate, with China bringing up the rear recently. We think that will go to 6 to 8% during the next 5 to 10 years. Most people think that's nuts. The other side of it, though, is this is highly deflationary. All of these technologies are deflationary, and that's why Bitcoin fits right into this new world as the payments ecosystem. So, but in terms of the convergence, so each one into its own S-curve, and these are massive growth opportunities, just massive opportunities. And so what do we have here? We have S-curves feeding S-curves because of this convergence. That's what you're feeling. And so it's going to create for these converged platforms super exponential growth. Most people in our business, this is the equity business for the most part, do not even understand exponential growth. So exponential growth, if you're at a decent growth rate, means you'll sustain that growth rate instead of law of large numbers decaying the growth rate, right? Super exponential means you're not only going to sustain a growth rate, but it's going to accelerate because of these convergences. So that's what's exciting about this.
AI is advancing at a faster rate than expected. leading to uncertainty among consumers and heightened concerns about job security, particularly among higher income earners. Cathie relates this situation to the late 1800s and early 1900s, when technologies like telephone, electricity, and the internal combustion engine similarly disrupted society and created widespread uncertainty. Cathie believes that Bitcoin, AI, and other emerging technologies will significantly impact wealth creation and living standards in the coming years. She predicts a surge in productivity driven by these technologies, potentially leading to annual real GDP growth of 6 to 8% over the next 5 to 10 years, a figure far exceeding traditional economic forecasts. However, she also acknowledges that these technologies have deflationary potential, meaning they could lower overall price levels. Nevertheless, the convergence of technologies like AI and Bitcoin, she argues, has the potential to unlock super exponential growth opportunities. Here are more clips of the discussion.
It occurs to me as I've thought about my education that, and not even before that, in the 70s when I was growing up in Southern California, my father, Irish immigrant, was an engineer but had no education, so really wasn't well paid. And so really we were on a tight budget. And I remember we went through that inflation of the 70s, and I remember my father coming in, and that's really how I learned what inflation was, by listening to my father. And it put a real constraint on our budget, what was going on. We're seeing a bit of an echo of it in the last few years, especially when you think about food. And then Art Laffer is my professor at USC, and he starts talking about this inflation. Yeah. And going off the gold exchange standard in 1971. And I was starting to put the pieces of the puzzle together. And I ended up, Art Laffer is known for his fiscal policy. So Laffer curve, right? You may have heard of that. But he is a monetary scholar. His mentor was Robert Mundell, who won a Nobel Prize for his monetary theory. And he's as passionate about monetary theory as fiscal policy. And so I grew to love monetary policy. I started my career and moved to New York in 1980, and we were in the middle of this massive, we're double-digit inflation and interest rates. And we had Paul Volcker on monetary policy. We had Ronald Reagan come in. And, I was looking at the damage to the financial markets that inflation and interest rates were doing, not only to personal life, but to financial markets, and just how broad-based this mistake was and how many people it was affecting. And then, really, because of what I was doing at the time, I started in economics, had to make a call on inflation and interest rates. And so, again, I became at that very early age, maniacally focused on monetary policy. And so I think what Bitcoin, when we did our first paper on Bitcoin in 2015, so we're going to look at any disruptive innovation. We actually started in 2011 at our prior firm, but started the firm at ARK at 2014. And we said, should this be one of our platforms? And we didn't break it out in the beginning. We had Next Generation Internet as a platform. And then two things happened. We did the white paper with Art Laffer in collaboration with him. And he said to me, wait a minute. I've been waiting for this. I thought he was going to criticize and throw the bums out, in terms of the kind of paper we wrote. But he read it and he said, wait a minute, if this is what I think, this is what I've been waiting for since 1971 when they closed the gold window in the United States. And he was in D.C. when that happened. He was mortified when it happened. And he is feeling now that he can get redemption with Bitcoin. So I think his everything that my life experience, what he taught us, and my own experience in my career have caused me to love Bitcoin. This is an answer to a lot of the world's problems.
Cathie Wood's affection for Bitcoin isn't just about making money. It's actually a story deeply rooted in her upbringing. Growing up in 1970s, Southern California, amid inflation and witnessing her engineer father's financial struggles, sparked her interest in economics and monetary policy. Her studies under the tutelage of renowned economist Arthur Laffer at USC, combined with first-hand experience of the high-inflation 1980s in New York, further solidified her grasp of economic dynamics. These formative experiences directly shaped Cathie's current focus on Bitcoin. Around 2015, she embarked on an intensive exploration of this disruptive innovation, which eventually became the cornerstone of her investment firm's strategy. Notably, her collaboration with Laffer on a seminal white paper about Bitcoin deepened her conviction in its potential to address long-standing economic challenges. For Cathie, Bitcoin represents more than just a financial opportunity. She views it as a potential solution to the economic issues she has studied for decades. This conviction fuels her advocacy for its widespread adoption. With that being said, here's a question for you. How do you think the increasing institutional interest in Bitcoin will influence its mainstream adoption and price stability in the future? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below and continue the conversation. If you found today's video informative and would like to receive more insights and updates on cryptocurrency and global finance, please consider liking the video, subscribing to our channel, and turning on post notifications. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll bring you more of the latest updates in crypto and digital finance. Until then, keep questioning, keep exploring, and most importantly, continue to invest wisely. Thank you for watching, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video.